everybody. I would like to begin by thanking Professor Narasimha, Professor Kumar and Dr. Narasimhan for inviting me to speak in this series. I also thank Narasimhan for the kind words he said about me, but he didn't take my advice. I suggested to him another way of introducing me and he didn't take that advice. So I'm going to introduce Narasimhan now. Narasimhan and I studied in the same high school. And I mentioned to him that that's all that you need to say. You really don't need to say anything else. I've known Narasimhan for a very long time. It's a pleasure to be here at this institute. Several people have asked me whether my talk is about cricket. And my answer has been it's up to you to decide whether it's about cricket or not. What I would like to do today is to talk to you about one aspect of Darwin's theory of natural selection, which has been misunderstood, misrepresented out of ignorance, out of carelessness, out of sloppy thinking, and sometimes out of mischief for at least 100 years since Darwin proposed the theory of natural selection. And it's only in the last quarter of a century or so that we have begun to realize that this misrepresentation of the theory of natural selection has led not only to misuse of biology outside biology, misuse of biology in human affairs, but has actually thwarted the growth of biology and the application of natural selection to many different areas of biology. But that's all behind us. But since this is a series on history of ideas, I want to go back to history and I want to recapitulate this period and point out how we have now put this period behind us and what are we doing now since we have put this period behind us. The simplest form of natural selection, or the simplest situation in which natural selection operates, is one which is easy to understand, easy to explain and difficult to misunderstand. And that simply has to do with the point that Darwin made repeatedly with a number of different examples, and I'll just use one very standard textbook example. This has to do with a certain insect, in fact a moth called Biston betularia, which is also called the peppered moth because it sort of looks like salt and pepper. And it turns out that before industrialization in rural England, this moth was very common, and people, of course, amateur entomologists were interested in collecting these moths, and they would find that most of the moths they found looked like this, but occasionally, very rarely, they would find a moth which was all black and which looked like this. And collecting one such moth was worth writing a postcard home saying, I found a black moth. So it was a very rare form. And the reason, according to Darwin's theory, why it was rare is that this moth has the habit of resting on trees, on the bark of trees, and at that time the bark of trees in rural England was typically covered with lichen, which looks like this, and when the peppered moth sits on a lichen covered tree, it is quite well camouflaged. It is invisible to birds who eat them, but if a black moth sits on the same kind of background, then of course it is extremely conspicuous and birds would find it and pick it up and eat it with a much higher probability, keeping the numbers of this low and the numbers of this relatively high. With industrialization, there were factories which let out smoke and soot settled on the bark of trees and killed off the lichens, and the trees came to look like this. Now as you can see, the fates of the two kinds of moths reversed. This moth became very conspicuous and began to be picked up by birds. This moth the black one became camouflaged, and its numbers actually rose as Darwin predicted it should. Now this is a natural experiment, but when you do an experiment in the laboratory, you demand more of the experiment. You say, now we must go back and change the conditions and see whether you get back the original condition. Fortunately, this experiment also happened in a natural sort of way. Very strict anti-pollution laws were enacted in England, which cleaned up the environment quite a bit. In many cases, the heights of the chimneys were increased, the amount of soot in the environment reduced, and lichen began to grow back on the trees. And in fact, people have documented that once that happened, once again, this black form became conspicuous, its numbers went down, and the peppered form became inconspicuous and its numbers went up. So this has been well documented. This is what Darwin meant by natural selection. Survival of the fittest. There would be some forms which do not survive well and they would gradually disappear. There would be other forms which would be fitter, which would survive better, and they would increase in numbers. As I said, this is an example that is difficult to misunderstand, that is difficult to misrepresent. But of course, natural selection, the idea of natural selection can be applied to all kinds of situations, and there are other situations where it is easy to misunderstand, easy to misrepresent, and that's obviously what I want to talk about. And I take one example there where it is particularly easy to misunderstand, and that has to do with the behavior that you see in many animal societies where animals fight with each other. In fact, most of the problems in applying natural selection come about when we try to apply natural selection to animals that live in societies, including humans, of course. In many animals, there are periodic fights, there are ritualized fights, and on the basis of these, animals often arrange themselves in what you might call a peck order or a dominance hierarchy. So you would have one alpha male or female, and then you would have individuals lower down in the hierarchy. This hierarchy is established, is understood, is widely known in the group, and is often respected. It is respected to the extent that when there is something that is in demand, limited amount of food or access to a desired female, then the dominant one almost has automatic access to this, and the ones lower on the hierarchy, almost as if voluntarily, they let the dominant one have access to this. And the question is, why should these subordinate individuals allow the dominant apparently easy access to these resources? And this is an example where it is easy to misunderstand how natural selection might deal with such a situation. And it is in this kind of situation, as I said, that Darwin's idea was misunderstood and misrepresented for a long time. I want to take one striking example of this misrepresentation. Many people misunderstood and misrepresented this. It was not restricted to non-biologists. Biologists were as guilty of doing this. Evolutionary biologists were as much guilty of doing this. And as I said, this happened for 100 years. And the worst part is that there are many textbooks, especially in this country, which continue to misrepresent this idea in this fashion, although many other people now have woken up. Now, I want to take the example of no less than a Nobel laureate, Konrad Lorenz, to illustrate how this might have been misrepresented. And I think this is fair to do. Nobel laureates get a great deal of credit for what they have done, and I think it's fair we take them as an example when we want to point out an error that they made. Konrad Lorenz is he's still famous, but he's not alive anymore, ethologist who studied animal behavior, and he's the one who in fact discovered that young birds would have a very sensitive period in which they would learn the identity of their mother, so that then they would be able to follow their mother. And here in fact is a picture of Konrad Lorenz being followed by birds which were imprinted on him. That's the word he used. Konrad Lorenz was very proud of the fact that he could substitute for the mother and get himself to be, the birds to be imprinted on himself, and then the birds would follow him. He would show this with great enthusiasm to the visitors to his house. Now, Konrad Lorenz wrote a book which also became very famous called On Aggression, and here he talked about aggression in animal societies and aggression in human societies. And here is a quote from what Konrad Lorenz had to say on aggression. He says, "Darwin has already raised the question of the survival value of fighting, and he has given us an enlightening answer." Now, what is the answer that Darwin has given according to Konrad Lorenz? It is always favorable to the future of the species if the stronger of two rivals takes possession either of the territory or of the desired female. This is the idea that many people had, that this is how natural selection would work. Natural selection would work to promote the good of the species, the long term of the species, doesn't matter what happens to the individuals in the species today. And this came to be known as group selection. That is, natural selection would favor what is good for the group, even though it is bad for the individual, whenever there was a conflict between the individual interests and the group interests, between the interests of the players and the interest of the whole team. And as I said, this misunderstanding, and Darwin was quite clear, he did not imply this at all in his writings. And this misunderstanding, as I said, arose because of ignorance, because of carelessness, certainly because of sloppy thinking, often non-mathematical thinking, and certainly out of mischief, because as you can imagine, if this is what nature does, it's a very convenient tool to use to justify inequalities in human societies. If individuals should sacrifice themselves for the good of the species, one could argue that this is what human beings should do, and many people did argue that there is a natural justification for the inequalities in human societies, and they use this in fact to justify inequalities in human societies. One Englishman, Vero Wynne Edwards, wrote a massive book in 1962 in which he took this group selectionist reasoning to its logical conclusion, and he wrote a book which is as massive as Darwin's book itself, and in which he tried to explain almost every aspect of animal behavior, ecology, from the point of view of group selection. Ironically, it is this book which Wynne Edwards wrote, in which he was the foremost champion of group selection. It is this book that in fact became a wake-up call for biologists, and because the book was so clearly written, so clearly argued, people woke up and said, this must be wrong, it can't be true. Until Wynne Edwards wrote his book, people used these arguments in a sufficiently sloppy way that you couldn't pin them down, you couldn't really realize that what they were saying might be wrong. But Wynne Edwards did a great service. He doesn't think that he was wrong, but I think that he has done a great service even though we think he is wrong, because he made the rest of us realize what happens. And this is something that you will see often. And I have always argued that if somebody is very passionate about a point of view, we should let him pursue that point of view. In fact, I have used the analogy that if somebody is willing to walk until he falls off the cliff, we should let him do so, because then we know how far you can walk. And that's what the community actually allowed Wynne Edwards to do, and I think he was completely wrong, but he did a great service. Now, people like Wynne Edwards and others argued, either implicitly or many times explicitly, that most living organisms have mechanisms to ensure that only the best individuals reproduce, so that the future of the species is in safe hands, that populations do not over-reproduce and exhaust resources and put the future of the species in jeopardy. That is, they have mechanisms not to overpopulate the environment. And in fact, they argued, and Wynne Edwards explicitly argued, that it is only the human species that somewhere along the way has lost this ability, and hence the present population of our high population density and high rates of population growth. Now, as I said, this book was a wake-up call for biologists. In fact, this book was published in 1962, and in 1964 there were two short papers in Nature back to back, one by an empiricist and other by a theoretician, who both suddenly woke up and said, this is all wrong. We have been saying this for 100 years, but clearly it is wrong. Now, the empiricist was a man called Christopher Perrins, who wrote a short note in Nature, as I said, and he took the example of birds that he studied, and he pointed out that what Wynne Edwards has assumed actually does not occur in nature. He provided empirical evidence to show that animals do not restrict their reproduction, they do not practice family planning, they do not control the rate of their population growth so as not to overpopulate, not to exhaust the resources. And John Maynard Smith, a very distinguished evolutionary biologist, wrote another short paper, as I said, next to that, called Group Selection and Kin Selection, and here he pointed out theoretical arguments why group selection of the kind that Wynne Edwards and many people before that for 100 years had espoused cannot really work. I'll just take very brief examples. In fact, in this paper, Christopher Perrins provided data from his own research, and he said if you look at the relationship between brood size and the number of chicks in a bird that he was studying, in fact it turns out that this bird has a natural clutch size of 3, which means it typically lays 3 eggs per nest. But it is capable of laying more eggs. And you can prove that because if you remove one egg, it will promptly replace it with another egg, which means it is intrinsically capable of laying more than 3 eggs, but it only lays 3 eggs. And this was used by people to say, look, this bird is actually controlling its population, it's not reproducing as fast as it can. But if you do more detailed studies, in fact Christopher Perrins showed that it is when it produces 3 eggs that in fact has the maximum average number of surviving chicks. 4 hungry mouths are too many to feed, and in fact if the bird lays 4 eggs, it will end up with fewer chicks. And it is of course not eggs that you should count, but it is surviving chicks that you should count. And he provided data year after year from his studies. In every case he showed that the number of eggs that the bird lays is in fact the optimum number of eggs, which allows it to maximize the number of surviving offspring that it produces, and there is no evidence in fact that it curtails reproduction with the future of the species in mind. Now John Maynard Smith, as I said, produced theoretical arguments. Now theoretical arguments are not easy to present in a short period of time, and I only have 2 minutes to devote to this. So what I am going to do is I am going to use cartoons. There is a very famous American cartoonist called Gary Larson, and Gary Larson uses biological subjects and themes often in his cartoon, and one wonderful cartoon of his is this one, which is supposed to be lemmings committing suicide because the population has overgrown. So the popular belief is that some animals like lemmings, when their population becomes too large, they go and commit suicide en masse so that the rest can survive and continue to reproduce, and they actually kill themselves for the sake of their group. This is the popular belief, and he illustrated that popular belief in this cartoon. Gary Larson had another cartoon about the same theme, and the title of this cartoon was Lemmings on a Suicide Mission, and this is that cartoon. I give you a minute to look at this. These are lemmings marching off to commit suicide. There's one guy who has a mischievous look on his face, and this. So what Maynard Smith basically said is that this attempt, even if there is an attempt on the part of some animals to curtail their individual reproduction to ensure the long-term survival of the species, there really is very difficult to keep away cheaters who would then populate the environment. So what would happen if this continues is that all the offspring of this guy would survive, and then they would never commit suicide. So you would come back to a group of selfish individuals. There is it's difficult to write an equation that captures this essence of this argument as clearly as this cartoon does. So that's really the problem with classical group selection. So today we have good reasons to believe, one, that organisms reproduce as rapidly as circumstances permit, without concern for availability of resources in the future. Individual interests usually prevail over group interests. Cheaters can easily invade a population of altruists who may be sacrificing their personal interests for the future good of the species. And most importantly, it's only humans, if at all, who have the ability to police cheaters and to ensure long-term survival of the group at the cost of personal interest of the individuals. So there was a complete 180 degrees turn when Edward argued that if at all, it's only the humans who have lost this ability which all other animals have, and today we believe that if there is one species which has this ability to somehow police and control cheaters and protect altruists from invasion of cheaters, it is really the human species with its advanced ability and its advanced social structure. So we have come full circle to realize exactly the opposite. Nevertheless, we must recognize that there are many examples in the animal kingdom where individuals do seem to sacrifice themselves for the good of their group. There are genuine examples, and these genuine examples were ignored by biologists because they thought there is no paradox in this. We already have the answer. They do so for the good of the species. If a honeybee kills herself, it's because of the good of the species. So this important problem of why there are genuine cases where individual players sacrifice themselves for the team was ignored because people thought we already have the answer. Now what happened in 1960s is we realized that we didn't have an answer, and therefore this kind of behavior, which I will use honeybees as an example to illustrate, became a major paradox in evolutionary biology which remained to be understood. Now I'll spend the next 5 minutes sort of giving you a primer on insect societies. There are many insect species which live in fairly complex, fairly sophisticated societies, often paralleling or matching human societies. Honeybee is of course a prime example of this. As you know, honeybees live in large colonies. There may be 30, 40, 50,000 individuals per colony, but in each colony there is just one fertile individual who we call the queen, and the rest are sterile individuals. Now, for most of these insect societies, for reasons that we don't fully understand, the males play little or no role in social life. They are born, they mature, they mate, and they die, and they do very little for the society itself. And it is really the females who organize themselves, with some exceptions. It's only the females who organize themselves into these societies, and therefore these societies often have been called feminine monarchies. So the honeybee is a prime example of a feminine monarchy, where in each colony or each hive there would be a single queen and maybe 50,000 of her daughters who are sterile, who have been called slaves in the past, and they spend their whole life working for the welfare of the queen and for the welfare of the queen's offspring. The queen does only two things. She lays eggs, sometimes thousands of eggs per day, and she produces a host of chemical substances through which she keeps tabs on the colony, through which she regulates the behavior of all of these workers, and in some sense she runs the colony through these chemical messengers, through these chemical weapons, if you like. And it is the workers who do all the other tasks. The workers build the nest, they clean the nest, they bring food, they process the food, they feed the brood, they take care of the brood, they act as nurse bees, they guard the nest, and of course they go out and look for food. They spend their whole life working in this fashion, and they die without ever having offspring of their own. So they are actually sacrificing not just their time and energy, but actually their ability to reproduce for the welfare of the queen. Now this is altruism, this is genuine altruism, but another behavior that honeybees show, which is much more spectacular and which makes their altruism much more clear, is the fact that when honeybees guard their nest, if there is danger to their nest, they do not hesitate to commit suicide in order to protect their colony. In fact, many of you may have experienced that if you mess with a honeybee colony, the workers will come and sting you. But many of you may not have realized that the act of stinging for a worker bee is an act of suicide. When the honeybee pierces its sting into your body, that sting cannot be withdrawn because it has barbs pointing outwards, because of which the sting cannot be withdrawn. The bee, of course, tries to withdraw. Her abdomen ruptures. The sting, the poison gland, and a part of our digestive system are left hanging on your body while the bee flies away, only to die within a few minutes. And indeed, the poison gland which is hanging on your body continues to pump venom. It has been measured for some 60 seconds after the bee has flown away. Indeed, a very efficient machine of delivering poison into your body, because you can't shoo it away. In fact, most people who are stung by bees chase the bee which is flying away, but that's not what you should be doing. You should be removing the sting which is in your body. But for that individual bee, this is an act of suicide. And honeybee workers do not hesitate to sting individuals and commit suicide. Here is a volunteer who let himself be stung for the sake of this photograph. This is a bee whose abdomen has ruptured. This is the sting. This is the poison gland, and this is a part of her digestive system which she is going to leave behind, and she will fly away in a few minutes. Now, honeybees are not the only creatures which live in such societies which show such altruistic behavior, but a whole host of insects do that. In particular, in addition to bees, there are ants. Ants have taken social life in some ways to greater heights. In the case of honeybees, each bee does many different things. In the case of many ants, the workers' ants are so specialized that they are born with a specific body structure which makes them suitable to do a certain kind of task. For example, all of these ant types, all of these morphologies constitute members of a single species in a single colony, starting from individuals who have these large heads and large mandibles to very small individuals who have very small mandibles. So ants are born specialized to do certain tasks, and that's the only task they can do in the rest of their life. So their altruism begins at birth, so to speak. They are born not to be able to reproduce, not to do certain tasks, but only to do certain other kinds of tasks. In fact, the worker ants are born without wings. It's only the future reproductives, the males and the females, who are born with wings, and as you know, even they shed their wings when they start a new colony. Ants do many other interesting things. In fact, insect societies are able to do tasks that solitary insects would never be able to do, primarily because of their ability to cooperate in large numbers, sacrifice personal interest and work for the good of the group and die in the process if necessary. Another very spectacular example is the so-called weaver ant. These ants you will see all over here, these ants stitch leaves together to form large nests, and these you will see hundreds and thousands of ants have to come together, pull two leaves together, bring them together and then actually stitch them with silk. Now adult insects do not produce silk. Silk is a property only of young individuals, of the larvae, and in fact when they succeed in bringing leaves together, one of the ant goes into the nest, gets hold of an ant larva and brings that larva and squeezes that larva appropriately, persuades it to release some silk and stitches this silk. This larva is releasing some silk for the community good, which it is sacrificing, because the silk is meant for it to spin a cocoon for itself to prevent dehydration when it becomes a pupa. So some of the silk this larva is willing to donate. So here is another act of altruism. And to many other interesting things, there are very famous ants in the New World called leaf cutter ants. What these ants do is they go out, they collect leaves, they cut them into small bits of the size that they can carry, bring it back to the nest. There is another class of ants inside the nest who will chew these leaves into small pieces, and there is yet another class of ants who will actually inoculate these broken leaves by fungi, by fungal spores. So these ants actually raise a fungal garden inside their nest, and it is the fungal spores that they feed on and not on the leaves themselves. Termites are yet another example of highly specialized and sophisticated insect societies. Now, the difference between termites and the rest of the insects I have been talking about is only the termites have a bisexual society. They have kings, they have queens, they have male workers and they have female workers. But the ants, bees and the wasps, as I said, are feminine monarchies. So here is an artist's depiction of what happens in a termite colony. Here is a queen and this is a king. He doesn't look very impressive, but nevertheless he is the king and he lives with her in the royal chamber and he continuously inseminates her, and the eggs produced by the queen are then taken by the workers and distributed to other chambers in the nest. Some of the offspring of these termites are allowed to stay on and become secondary queens and kings, as you will see in this case. That's how termite societies work. And finally we have the wasps, which is what we work on. This is a highly advanced wasp society, and many of these wasps are called paper wasps, and the reason why they are called paper wasps is they actually build their nest from paper, and this is paper that they manufacture. They scrape cellulose fibers from plants, apply chemical substance to it, masticate it and make it into a pulp and spread it into a thin layer, not very different from the way in which we manufacture paper. In fact, this is a advanced wasp society, and the wasp nest is actually located inside this, and here is a paper envelope through which they have covered the whole nest for protection. There is just one little opening through which the foragers fly in and out. Now if you are courageous enough to remove this nest, you will be rewarded, of course with some stings, but also with what you see inside, which is a multi-storied apartment complex, and they have several tiers of comb, and they use all of this to rear brood. So wasps again live in societies where there is a single queen inside this, thousands of workers who are working and who never reproduce on their own in their lifetime to produce these structures and to rear brood, all the brood being the offspring of one individual, which is the queen. If you turn it around, you will in fact see these hexagonal structures. All of these white things are actually caps of the brood, which is the pupa inside. So they have completed larval development and become pupae. Now what we are most concerned in all of this, of course there are many interesting things to study about insect societies. How do they get together, how do they communicate, how do they manage to do all of these things. But the fundamental question, the quintessential paradox of social insects or insect society is the altruism. And in order to understand that, now since we know we cannot simply assume that animals will behave in a manner that's good for the species, we need a better understanding. First we have to begin by defining what we mean by altruism and selfishness in more precise way, because these are terms that we have borrowed from the human context, and in the human context these terms are loaded with connotation, and we want to strip them of all of this connotation and we want to define them in a precise way. Any act, any behavior performed by one individual directed towards another individual, the consequence of which is that the recipient suffers and the actor benefits, is what we will call selfishness. And suffer and benefit being measured in the number of offspring they can leave behind, in what we call Darwinian fitness. So in Darwinian terms, if the recipient suffers and the actor benefits from any interaction, we will call that selfishness, and the converse is altruism, where the recipient benefits and the actor suffers, again in Darwinian terms. Excuse me. Now this is the paradox one has to explain. How would natural selection favor such a behavior, that is altruistic behavior? It's easy to understand how natural selection would promote selfish behavior. Now as I said, in the mid 1960s there was a modification of Darwin's theory of natural selection which allowed you to make this explanation. Now this modification was brought about by a man called William Hamilton, but even before William Hamilton actually came up with this formal modification, there was a hint of this in the literature. Excuse me. A man called J.B.S. Haldane, a very famous biologist of the 20th century, who spent the latter part of his life in India, is believed, is almost certain, to have realized the essence of the idea. Now Haldane was a remarkable man. There are many things remarkable about him, but one of the most remarkable things about him was that he put his most profound ideas in obscure little writings somewhere which was not a scientific paper at all. And in fact there is just a little paragraph which suggests that J.B.S. Haldane actually had the essence of today's modern theory of evolution, which allows us to explain altruism. And the simplest way to explain the germ of the idea that Haldane had is to tell a story, and one of my former students has actually prepared a cartoon which makes it easy for me to tell the story. This is J.B.S. Haldane, and the story goes as follows: that Haldane was supposed to be walking on the bank of a lake with a friend of his, and he's supposed to have suddenly got a flash idea, made some calculations on the palm of his hand, and declared that if one of my brothers is drowning in this lake, I will probably not consider it worth my while to jump into the lake and attempt to save him. But if 3 or more of my brothers are drowning in this lake, I will probably jump and try to save them, even at a risk to my life. And what Haldane meant by this is that if you look at evolution not from the point of view of the individual, but from the point of view of the genes of the individual which program the behavior of this individual, then if an individual sacrifices itself to save just one of its brother, then in fact there would be a net loss of genes, because we share only 50% of our genes with our brothers and sisters. If Haldane dies and his brother is recovered, then that gene which makes Haldane altruistic, makes him to jump in the river, will be lost, and there's only 50% chance that the brother who is saved will actually have a copy of that gene. However, Haldane said that if he died, that copy of the gene was lost, and if 3 of his brothers were saved in the process, then there is a 1.5 chance that at least one copy of that gene would be recovered, because there are 3 of them, each has a 50% chance of having that gene. So for every gene lost, 1.5 copies of the genes would be recovered, and in fact altruism of this kind would actually spread in the population. That is, if one altruistic gene could kill itself to rescue many more copies of such a gene, then of course such a gene would spread in the population. So you could then imagine that Haldane might have said that if 1, 2 or 3 nephews are drowning, he would probably look the other way, because we only share 25% of our genes with our nephews, but if 5 or more nephews could be rescued, then it would be worthwhile for that individual to risk his life, because then one copy would be lost and at least 1.25 on average would be recovered. This is the essence of the idea which William Hamilton put in a more formal way. This is W.D. Hamilton. As you can see, he is my hero. I have several pictures of him. Hamilton was a remarkable man who died not long ago, in fact just about 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, while doing field work in Africa. And Hamilton came up with the formal idea of how one might explain the evolution of altruism. And Hamilton said that we must redefine Darwinian fitness. Darwinian fitness so far has been defined as the number of offspring that somebody leaves behind, and he said you should not count individuals, therefore you should not count offspring, you must look at it from the point of view of genes, and we not only share our genes with our offspring, but we also share genes with our relatives, and the fitness, the Darwinian fitness of an individual should be computed not only by counting how many offspring this individual has left behind, but how many genetic relatives for whose survival this individual has been responsible. And he said therefore we must have a broader concept of fitness, which he said we will let us call inclusive fitness, and inclusive fitness then is the sum of a direct component which is gained through offspring production plus an indirect component gained through aiding of genetic relatives. And with this idea, Hamilton actually wrote down an extremely simple piece of algebra. He said altruism would be favored by natural selection if this condition holds. If the relatedness between the actor and the recipient multiplied by the benefit to the recipient minus the cost to the actor is greater than 0, then natural selection would favor altruism, and if this is not greater than 0, then natural selection would favor selfishness. And it is a very simple formulation that he wrote, and people are now trying to use this formulation and ask, do animals behave as if they are aware of this algebra? Do animals behave as if they are maximizing such inclusive fitness? In other words, is altruism always only of the kind that will actually satisfy this inequality, or do we find altruism which also violates this inequality? If we find altruism which violates inequality, then we are back to square one, then we don't know how to explain this. But if all cases of altruism that we know satisfy this inequality, then we seem to have an explanation. So people are looking at this, and several people are looking at it, and I and my students are also trying to test this idea by looking at a social insect which we find quite abundantly here. In fact, most of our work is done on the campus of the Indian Institute of Science, and we work with this social wasp, which is also a paper wasp, but it very conveniently does not cover its nest with an envelope, which allows us to watch these individuals, and also it very conveniently does not increase the number of individuals in the colony beyond 30, 40, which makes it very easy for us. We actually mark these individual wasps with spots of colored paint and follow their behavior throughout their life. We are able to watch everything that they do. They do build a paper nest with the same kind of hexagonal cells as the other wasps I showed you. In all of these individuals, although they all look identical, there is one queen, and there is a single queen. She does all the egg laying and all the others do all the work. In fact, it's very nice they all look identical, because the fact that they are all identical means that the role of who will be queen and who will be worker is quite flexible. And in fact, it is not decided at birth. When a group of individuals get together, they actually fight, and the winner of the fight becomes the queen, and the others are forced to take on the role of worker. But the queen is not allowed to go in peace forever. She is constantly challenged. Her ability to lead the colony is constantly under check, and if she seems to fail, then she is driven out, and the next one in line takes over and becomes the next queen. And that is how this society functions. So the question we ask is, when is it better? Okay, let me just give you one more piece of information. How are new colonies of these wasps initiated? There are at least two ways in which they are initiated. One is a single wasp goes out, she builds a nest, lays eggs, feeds her larvae, and brings her daughters to adulthood all by herself. So one option that the wasps have, go off and be on your own. Another option they have is to stay back in their mother's nest and almost certainly work as a sterile individual, helping your mother to produce more offspring. Excuse me. So there are these two major options that the wasps have. Now the act of going off on your own we can call a selfish option, because she is going to go and produce her own offspring. The act of staying back and helping the mother to produce more offspring, we can think of that as an altruistic option. And the question is, what would natural selection favor? Now what we find, of course, is that most individuals are willing to stay back and help their mother, and only a small fraction of individuals are selfish. They go off on their own and try to produce their own offspring. And the question is, why does this happen? Does Hamilton's rule allow us to explain this behavior? So the question we ask ourselves is, when is it better to be a sterile worker instead of a fertile solitary nest foundress? Because most individuals prefer to be sterile workers. So under what conditions would this be favored? And according to Hamilton's theory, it would be favored if the inclusive fitness of the worker strategy is in fact greater than the inclusive fitness of the solitary foundress strategy. What this means is that we must measure the inclusive fitness of these two strategies, inclusive fitness of wasps who follow these two strategies. Now in the case of most insect societies, this is very difficult to do. This is very difficult to do because in a species either individuals are solitary or they are social. Now there are a small number of species such as the one we study, where in the same species some individuals would be selfish and solitary, others would be altruistic and social, and therefore we can actually measure the costs and benefits of each of these strategies in the same species. Because the moment you measure it in different species, you don't know what else is different between these two species. So that's a great advantage of this species. Nevertheless, let me assure you, it's not so very straightforward to go and measure inclusive fitness. I and many of my students have been working at least for 20 years in an attempt to make these measurements. And every time I speak, I give you a progress report. How far have we come right now? I'll only give you a sort of flavor of the way we are approaching this problem. What we are doing is we are measuring inclusive fitness in the following way. We have decided to break down inclusive fitness into three components. One which we call a productivity factor, that is how much work can a wasp do all by herself. The second is the genetic relatedness. Who is the wasp helping with this work? Is she helping her sons and daughters, helping her brothers and sisters, helping her nieces? Who is she helping? And finally, a so-called demographic correction factor. Namely, what are the chances that the wasp will actually die before she completes the job that she has initiated? And with these three measurements, we hope to get a reasonable idea of what the inclusive fitness is. And we would like to measure these components both for a solitary wasp and for a social wasp. And therefore, we come up with the following formulation, that if the product of these three factors, the genetic relatedness, the demographic correction factor and the productivity factor, if the product of this for the worker is greater than the solitary individual, then we can say that this theory would predict that individuals should in fact be altruistic, they should stay back in their mother's nest and they should help the mother to rear offspring. Now we cannot actually measure all of these things in a straightforward fashion. What we are trying to do is we are trying to ask whether we take one of these components and we ask, is rho greater than r? That is the worker having an opportunity to translate its work towards more closely related individuals than a solitary individual, or is the demographic correction factor for a worker different than for a solitary individual? Is the probability of dying different for a worker and a solitary individual, or is the actual productivity, can a worker do more work per unit time than a solitary individual? Because these are very different behavioral situations and we would like to understand how wasps behave in these situations, and we are trying to ask whether there is a inequality in the genetic relatedness term itself, which I call a genetic predisposition for the evolution of altruism, or is there a demographic predisposition for the evolution of altruism, or is there an ecological or physiological predisposition for the evolution of altruism. So let me spend a minute or two on each of these. We first looked at the genetic predisposition and we found in fact that quite surprisingly the queens of this species are polyandrous, which means they mate with more than one male, and because they mate with more than one male, they produce not just full sisters but they produce half sisters, and because they produce half sisters, the relatedness within the colony drops below what one might have expected theoretically. Now not only are the queens polyandrous, but I already said that even though the winner can become the queen, she is not left in peace for very long. her ability to lead the colony is constantly judged and she is frequently replaced by somebody else. And this phenomenon is actually quite common, and we have studied this phenomenon over many years, and by watching how one queen is replaced, another queen takes over, we have in fact constructed what you might call a royal pedigree. In fact, I am very fond of saying that this is the first royal pedigree of any invertebrate animal, where you can actually study how individuals succeed in each other for the role of the queen. And by looking at this kind of phenomenon, we ask ourselves, what is the relationship between today's queen and tomorrow's queen? And over many years of study, we have found that the relationship between queens and their immediate predecessors can be that of daughters, sisters, nieces, or even cousins. Now, this is just for immediate predecessors, for successive queens. But if you ask today's queen and the queen 3 generations ago, then of course it will be much, much less relatedness. Now, based on this, we can ask, if a wasp decides to stay in her mother's nest and take care of the brood there, who is she going to feed? Is she going to feed her sisters and brothers, or is she going to feed somebody else? Now, that depends on whether the queen has changed since then. And in fact, we found, to everybody's surprise, that the wasp who stays back in her mother's nest may end up feeding her sisters, brothers, nieces and nephews, cousins, cousins' offspring, mother's cousins, offspring, and even mother's cousins' grandchildren. As I say, that this wasp society will put to shame any Indian joint family, because this is the kind of genetic relatedness that you find within the colony. This is the diversity of individuals who live in a colony. Now, because of these 2 factors, we actually have been able to show that the relatedness between the wasp who stays back in her mother's nest and the brood she feeds, in fact, is less, not more, than that of a selfish solitary individual who goes off on her own. So, we in fact do not find evidence for genetic predisposition in this species. Now, to look at whether there is ecological or physiological predisposition, now this, they have done many different experiments. All I will do is explain to you one experiment which one of my students did, because I think that was the cleverest experiment we have done for this particular question. What my student did was that he went out and he identified newly formed nests, and he took these nests and he found that in some nests there was one individual who was the queen, others who were already acting as workers, and in all of these nests he removed the queen and he removed all but one of the workers. Now, this individual was left alone, and she then was now like a solitary individual. So, wasps who had on their own chosen to be subordinate, he forced them to be the leader of their group, because he left them alone. And he asked, can they do as well as those who on their own decided to be alone? And he showed, in fact, that's not true at all. The so-called co-foundresses who were forced to nest alone did much worse than a naturally solitary foundress. What this means is that all wasps are not born equal. More importantly, they seem to know that they are not born equal, and they will adopt a strategy depending on what they are capable of doing. Every wasp will not venture out on her own to build her own nest. Only some wasps will do, and in fact those that do are better at doing so than those that do not do. And this actually came as quite a bit of a surprise, but from this we are able to say, in fact, that there is ecological or physiological predisposition, because for a worker the productivity in fact is greater than for a solitary foundress. That is, if you take an individual who opts to be a worker, forces her to be solitary, she actually does much poorly than such an individual. Therefore, by sacrificing the ability to go out alone, they are not sacrificing as much as you think they might be sacrificing, because they are not so good at it anyway. Whereas those who are good at it actually go out and do that. And those who don't go and stay back in the mother's nest and say, I'll help you, are the ones who are not very good at going off on their own. And there is this intrinsic difference in the individual, and the altruism of the wasp is dictated by this intrinsic ability of their being able to manage on their own. This is a fairly new finding. Now, therefore, I will put a tick on this, but now I want to spend a few minutes on what I call a demographic predisposition. This is something which had been completely ignored earlier, and the idea that I have tried to test here is the following. The idea is actually a very straightforward one. The idea is that if an individual goes off on her own, starts her own nest, then she has to be necessarily alive until she finishes her job. She produces eggs, she has to wait till those eggs become larvae, then she has to feed those larvae, wait till they become pupae, guard them as pupae because somebody will eat them up otherwise, and when they become adults, only then can she die in peace. And if she dies anywhere along this way, all the work she has done so far is a waste. Whereas if you live in a group, if one individual does some work and dies, whatever work she has done so far doesn't necessarily go a waste because somebody else can continue that work. And therefore the term I have coined is that if you are solitary, you do not have assured returns for your investment. Whereas if you are in a group, you have relatively more assured returns for your investment of work, and therefore I call this the assured fitness returns model. And I have tried to test this model by actually looking at the probability that individuals will die before they finish their work. And by doing so, I have actually been able to show, so I compute fitness for solitary foundresses as a step function. My solitary foundresses in my model get no fitness until they finish their job. The day they finish their job, they get all the fitness in one pack. It's like a monthly salary. Whereas my workers are like daily wage workers. They get a little fitness for every day that they survive because the work they have done is not going to go a waste. So by computing fitness for solitary individuals, for workers in this fashion and for solitary in a step fashion, I show that there is a substantial inequality between the two classes of individuals. In fact, the demographic correction factor for a solitary individual is 0.12, whereas for a worker it is as much as 0.43. So there is an increment from 0.12 to 0.43 because of this linear accumulation of fitness on every day. Because if you die halfway through, those who are getting a step function, those that die, they get 0. And that's this inequality. And from this inequality I can show in at least two different ways that being a worker is more advantageous than being on your own. One way I show that is by showing that a worker would get the same fitness as a solitary foundress even if she rears brood who are only related to her by 0.14, whereas a solitary individual is rearing brood who is related to her by 0.5. Another way I show it is that a worker will break even with a solitary foundress even if the solitary foundresses work 3.6 times harder than them. I can be 3.6 times lazier than a solitary individual, and yet I get the same fitness as a solitary individual, because on average if a worker dies, somebody continues her work. Whatever she has done so far is not necessarily going to go a waste. Therefore, demographic predisposition seems to be real, and I put a tick there, and you can see that we have been able to show this inequality is quite strong. Now what we are doing at the moment is we are trying to combine all of these things into a unified model, and the reason why we are doing that is very straightforward. Even if we show that there are many models which suggest that the wasp should be altruistic, they should be workers, that doesn't solve the problem, because what do we see in nature? We find that while most individuals want to stay back in their mother's nest and help them, there are a few who want to go out, and we therefore have to explain why is it that some go out and others stay back. Now we are not yet in a position of saying this wasp should go out and this wasp should stay back, but at least we seem to be in a position of saying that in a certain environment, in a certain population, what proportion of the individuals should stay back and what proportion should leave. And by combining all of these, and I will not go into the details, I will just give you the final result, you will have to take my word for it. We have actually come up with a prediction that only about 5% of the individuals should venture out on their own, build their own nest and be solitary, selfish individuals, and about 95% of individuals should simply stay back in their mother's nest or be part of groups and help one individual. And in fact, we find one of my students went and measured exactly what the wasps do, and there's a remarkable sort of fit between what we predicted and what we find. He found that something like 5 to 6% of the wasps prefer to be solitary, and in fact the rest of them in fact prefer to nest in groups where they help other individuals. So there is quite a bit of support for this way of looking at things, and in fact we find that the wasps seem to behave in the fashion that our models predict that they do. Now, so what is the conclusion from all of this? The conclusion, unfortunately, is not very straightforward. I cannot tell you when players should sacrifice themselves. This life is complicated, and I think we have to accept that it's complicated. At least the studies of this species and many other animals have have convinced us that sociality and altruism are complex phenomena and they are favored under special ecological, physiological, demographic and genetic situations that some organisms find themselves in, and therefore that is when players should sacrifice themselves for the sake of their team. Now, we have not stopped here. We have also asked whether sociality can be lost or when should players revolt against their captain. And we also find that this is a theoretical possibility and probably actually a real possibility in insect societies. Now, there are some species of ants which do not produce queens anymore. They seem to have stopped producing queens and the workers seem to manage on their own. One of the workers is elected, so to speak, as the leader and she does the reproduction, but they do not produce queens anymore. And we have begun to study this species. This is an ant species which is also found on the campus here, and we have begun to study this species to understand when or why do players revolt against their captain, when do they actually get rid of their queen. And I want to spend a minute telling you about this ant because it's a rather remarkable ant. It's okay. So this is what we are interested in. We are interested in what we might call reverse social evolution, and the reason why I am studying this is that the models that I have worked with are completely symmetrical with reference to direction. Whether evolution will go from solitary to social or social to solitary seems to depend on the numerical values of the parameters in the model. There is nothing in the model which tells you that it will go in this direction, and numerical values of parameters can of course change, and therefore I think this is a bidirectional process. Maybe it happens much more often from solitary to social. If so, we must ask why does it happen much more often, but one cannot rule out the possibility that evolution will actually turn back and make social species into solitary species. So this is the ant we are studying. It's called Diacama. It's actually called Diacama ceylonense. It was described first from Ceylon and it's widely distributed on our campus. Now what this wasp does is very interesting. As I said, first of all, this ant does not produce queens. All the individuals are workers, and one worker is a functional queen. She behaves like a queen, and she is able successfully to suppress all the other workers and prevent them from reproducing. And the way she is able to do that is quite remarkable. Every ant, this is the nest of the ant, for example. As I said, if you take a walk on the campus here, you will see many such nests on the ground, often with a little mound, and sometimes these mounds are actually decorated with feathers, with corpses of insects. And the reason why they decorate this seems to be that this is the most ancient method of harvesting water. This is in fact the way they harvest dew. They bring these feathers and, as I said, dead bodies of insects and some twigs and decorate the mound, and dew settles on this at night, which is not absorbed, and in the morning the ants come out and actually drink this water. And they do this of course in the particularly in the dry months, and that's how they actually harvest water. But if you look at these ants, it turns out that every ant is born with a pair of structures on its thorax. These are supposed to be wing buds, or these are supposed to be ancient wings. Ant workers don't have wings, but these are relics of wings. And every ant is born with these two. It turns out that the first ant to be born in a nest will actually physically bite off these structures from everyone who comes after her. And for reasons that we don't fully understand, those ants who are bitten in this fashion cannot attract males, cannot mate, and therefore cannot be a threat for this individual, cannot lead the colony, cannot become a functional queen, and cannot replace this individual. It also turns out that this is a perfect system to make sure that the colony has only one functional queen, but has at least one. Because if the individual who has retained her gemme, if she dies, then the next one to be born actually retains her gemme. Because once again, for reasons that we don't understand, those who are bitten do not bite others. So the next one to come out will find everybody is already bitten and they will not bite her. So she will keep her gemme and then she will bite everybody else who comes after her. This seems to be a perfect mechanism of ensuring that there is only one, but not less than one individual who retains his gemme, who can mate and who can reproduce and who can lead the colony. But these workers have stopped producing queens, and we want to use this species to understand when will these insect societies behave in a fashion that might be interpreted as revolting against their captain, getting rid of their queen and trying to manage on their own. So, to summarize all of this, social life, altruism are complex phenomena, and often what you see in the animal kingdom is that there is a very fine balance between cooperation and conflict. You seldom find pure cooperation or pure conflict, and it is this fine balance between cooperation and conflict which is what life or survival is all about, and this you will find by looking at many different kinds of animals. I have just taken the example of one species because I know it better, I work on it, but by looking at studies on various kinds of insects, birds, mammals, the message that we get is that this is a very complex phenomenon, but most important message is that there is a very fine balance between cooperation and conflict, and it often takes very little to tip the balance and move towards either cooperation or conflict, and this is the broad phenomenon that I and my students are interested in studying. I will stop here.